Okay, so hello everybody. I hope you're all doing good. I'm just going to check that a couple people probably still might want to file in. So I'll wait a minute for more people to arrive and then start. But I hope everybody's doing well. And to begin with, I'll actually say a quick word in EWB. So EWB are a society at Warwick, and we tend to do a lot of work related to outreach and also different discussion events that we've run throughout the year, similar to the one we're running today. And really what we're trying to achieve with these events is opening up discussions on topics that we find are relevant nowadays. And we're not necessarily trying to find answers to questions, but more so opening up ideas of different perspectives to widen our points of views about it. So first of all, I want to thank David Chapman for letting EWB run this event with Green Week. Green Week is a week-long event now coming towards its end, where there's been a bunch of different organizations such as Warwick University and Coventry University hosting events to raise awareness about sustainability, and as such EWB feel that it's something that's very relevant, especially I think to a lot of young students at the moment who are who feel very strongly about the topic of sustainability. So this EWB event is about moving towards global sustainable energy, specifically looking at the ownership of energy transition. And to begin with, I will give a quick overview on the event, introduce our speakers, and then give out a few key figures with regards to the topic today so that everybody can kind of come to the same idea of what we'll be discussing. So the format will be a discussion event. It'll start by being kicked off with a few prompts that I'm going to be asking our two speakers, and then if anybody has any questions that they wish to ask, please feel free to message in a chat, and we will try and get to them. So our two speakers today are Mathieu Blondeel and Professor David Elmes, both from WBS. Mathieu is a postdoctoral research fellow, and he's doing some research based around different energy projects, such as the geopolitical economy of energy system transformation and Brexit and beyond, UK net zero energy policy. Mathieu, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, good evening or good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's almost evening because I'm calling in from Belgium. So anyway, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to have interesting discussions about energy transition and much more. And it's interesting that you said that the purpose of these talks are not necessarily to answer or to find answers to questions, because I still have a lot of questions as well, and I'm afraid I don't have all the answers to the questions that I've been dealing with in the past couple of years. That said, so I have a PhD in international relations, and in my research at the Warwick Business School, I'm actually interested in a variety of topics at the intersection of global energy and climate politics. For example, I'm interested in the geopolitics of energy transitions. What's going to happen with an energy superpower, quote unquote, like Russia? What's going to happen with their geopolitical relevance if, for example, a region like Europe becomes less dependent on Russian natural gas exports to this region? But also another question that might be relevant as well is, are there emerging conflicts around critical materials that will be essential in these energy transitions? For example, are there new conflicts emerging around lithium access or cobalt between, say, for example, the United States and China? So these are a couple of questions that I'm interested in relation to the geopolitics of energy transitions, but I'm also concerned with how financial actors are dealing with this transition and what their position is in this, such as not just public financial actors such as central banks, export credit agencies, but also private ones, banks, insurers, institutional investors, etc. And also, most importantly, or most interestingly today, perhaps also what are the consequences for large fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, like Shell, like BP, etc.? What's their role in this transition? How affected are they by climate change policies and mitigation efforts around the world? So look forward to having these discussions, and thanks for having me.
No, of course, we're really excited to hear what you have to say. And actually, a lot of the things that you've touched upon, I think, are things we're going to be discussing later in this event. And yeah, I think it's definitely something that raises a lot of questions that we don't necessarily have answers to. So it'll be quite interesting to discuss. Our other speaker is David Elmes, and he is professor of management practice and head of the WBS Global Energy Research Group. And he does some research focused on how evolving economic forces are leading to changes in the industry. So that kind of touches upon things that Mathieu has mentioned. David, would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Hi, yes, thanks very much for inviting me to this session. I hope we're going to have a really good conversation. Yeah, so my background is working for quite some time in the energy industry, both the supply side and the consumption side. And then I came and joined the business school here at Warwick to try and step back and work out what was going on. And a lot's been going on, more than I had estimated. And I suppose the perspective I look at it is the energy industry is responsible for about 2/3 or even more of emissions, and therefore it's got a big responsibility to try and do something about it and be part of the solution. But what that involves is a fairly major shift in what the industry does. And if you look at it from a purely from a money perspective, it means shifting an awful lot of investment from fossil fuel industries into alternatives. And it's not just the renewable energy alternatives, it's also about investing to use a lot less energy as well. So let's not forget the sort of energy efficiency side of things. And I suppose my personal interest, which touches on what Mathieu is talking about, is the so what for the various companies that we know, who are going to be the winners and losers, and who's going to manage to change themselves from one sort of company to another sort of company. There's a second thing that I'm quite interested in, which is, we talk about these big global companies and what are they going to do. For me, what's quite interesting is, well, how much of this energy transition is going to go from being centrally provided by big global companies to being locally provided by a lot of different companies. And so I'm quite involved with what the university is trying to do to change the way that we do things. So for me, there's a second interesting perspective, which is, do you do big, large solutions centrally, or do you do local solutions in a more sustainable way? So I'm looking forward to the discussion. As Mathieu says, there's lots of questions to be asked, and it'd be really interesting to try and talk through some of those and see if we've got some good solutions.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much. And actually, I feel like what you're saying is quite relevant, especially in terms of local production of energy, because I remember there's another discussion event that we hosted where one of our speakers had mentioned that actually, well, transportation in itself is one of the most energy intensive, energy demanding sectors. So there's an argument that actually localizing energy production and distribution means that you're removing part of the energy demand in itself. So that's quite interesting. So moving on, we're going to first look at a few figures from the International Energy Agency. And these figures are a little bit outdated. They're from 2018, but I think they'll still give us a pretty good idea of the general trends that there are in energy at the moment. So for example, global energy consumption has increased nearly twice the average rate of growth since 2010. And this means also energy-related CO2 emissions rose about 1.7% to a historic high in 2018 of 33.1 gigatons of CO2. Some of the biggest players that are involved with this are China, India, and the United States, who accounted for 85% of the net increase in emissions. However, there are certain areas as well where there is a certain amount of decrease in emissions, such as Germany, Japan, Mexico, France, or the UK. And actually, renewables and nuclear power are the ones that met the majority of the growth in demand. And I think this kind of goes back to a point that was mentioned that, well, actually, it's not just about renewable energies. There is also the idea of a different kind of sustainable energies. And, well, I guess we can have some debate as to whether nuclear power is really sustainable in the long term, at least with regards to nuclear waste. But I think that's a slightly discussion to have, different discussion to have. But yes, in general, there is an increasing growth of nuclear power and renewables. However, there is still many coal and gas-fired power plants that are increasing their generation, which have contributed to driving up CO2 emissions in that sector by 2.5%. Looking at this graph, we can see that whereas there has been certain amount of emissions avoided thanks to things such as energy efficiency, which kind of bounces back to what David Elmes said of actually part of the solution isn't necessarily just finding renewables, but reducing our need for demand and finding more efficient systems. However, we can also see that the avoided emissions are still outweighed by our increased growth in demand for energy globally. And this kind of highlights the key issue, the key gap issue that we have of, whereas there is a trend towards avoiding more emissions, it is not yet catching up to our growth in energy demand. So looking at fossil fuels, we can see in 2018, oil demand rose by 1.3%, but actually natural gas consumption rose even more than twice of that by 4.6%. And part of the reason for that might be because there is, as part of the energy solutions, there's some plants that are being switched from coal to gas, and that accounted for around 1/5 of the rise in gas demand. And the two biggest players in this growth are the United States and China, most likely due to their general large demand of energy. And whereas we see that there is an increase in things such as natural gas to try and switch to less polluting energy solutions, there is still a very large share of coal in primary energy demand and electricity generation. It's still the largest source of electricity and the second largest source of primary energy, which once again highlights this gap that we have in between energy demand and this push for sustainability. That being said, if we look at renewables, we can see that renewables in 2018 increased by 4%, accounting for almost 1/4 of global energy demand growth. And they covered almost 45% of the world's electricity generation growth. Well, it says now accounting for over 25%, but that was in 2018 of global power output. And some of the key technologies or areas of renewables that are responsible for this are things like solar, photovoltaics, hydropower, and wind, as well as bioenergy being a really big one. And we can also see that whereas coal is the majority producer of the majority producer of electricity, the renewables and power actually meant the majority of the growth in demand. So there is a trend more towards that that's slowing away from the traditional fossil fuels. But once again, we can still see that there is a gap that needs to be addressed. And I think one of the most important ways of addressing this gap in between our energy demand and the necessity for having more sustainable solutions is really looking at who might be the owners, who should be held accountable for finding a solution for that, which brings us to our first question. So I would like to ask our speakers, who would you say are the most important stakeholders in enabling the energy transition? Would you say that they're different depending on the regions we're looking at, or do you think that they are the same globally? I might start by asking David Elmes about this.
Thank you. I mean, it's a really interesting question because if you can work out who's the most important stakeholders, then you can try and influence things more effectively.
Yes.
I'm in a business school, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about money. And it says that at the moment, every year we invest about $2 trillion in the energy sector, both for supply and consumption of energy. And the question is, well, how much of that money is being spent by private companies and how much of it is being controlled or influenced by governments? And quite a large chunk of it is being spent through private companies, although some of them are state-owned and so on. And so for me, then it is this question of saying, well, if you want to influence the way that that private capital is spent, then it's making an argument that it's better spent on more renewable solutions. And luckily, we're seeing good news in that area in the way that the costs of renewable alternatives have been falling, that in many parts of the world now, it's a cheaper alternative to build new renewables than it is to keep on building gas or even coal powered stations. So, I mean, I'll pause there to let Mathieu add his comments, but it is this question of, there is some quite good news coming through in that renewable alternatives are often now more cost effective, and so that's why you're seeing the investment shifting across from the fossil fuels to renewables. Mathieu.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the introduction, Claire. I'm also at the business school, but my background is in international relations, so let me focus a little bit on state actors or governments. And I think David made a great point, saying that obviously it's difficult also to make this hierarchy or this distinction in terms of the importance of actors. But the role of policymakers, politicians, and state actors, may it be at the national level, subnational level, or maybe even supranational level in terms of the European Union's responsibilities, should not be underestimated here. And then I'm thinking not necessarily in terms of financing, because David said it. I mean, the bulk of the finance is coming from companies and businesses, corporations, state-owned or not. But they're crucial in terms of designing and constructing legislation and regulations, for example. Or that's at least where I believe their key responsibility lies. And that's extremely important in terms of the shape, the nature, but also the pace of the energy transition as we go forward. For example, what I think is really relevant is in the past couple of months, now 127 countries, national governments, have decided to go net zero. So by mid-century, 2050 in most cases, European Union, United States, and in the case of China by 2060. So if you have these companies setting these goals, setting these objectives, and accordingly also they roll out relevant regulations and legislation and midterm objectives and deadlines that have to be met, then these companies, these businesses, and all other relevant actors that are involved in this energy transition will have to adapt accordingly, may it be fossil fuel companies, but also renewable energy companies, etc. So to come back to this point of, well, who are the most important actors? I think the politically correct answer would be, well, both types of actors are equally important. Businesses or private capital and governments, but don't forget also the role of NGOs or organized civil society in terms of pushing regulations, in terms of pushing companies towards actively being involved in these energy transitions, but also in terms of organized civil society is also pushing investors, institutional investors, to redirect finance streams, to divest away from fossil fuel assets into renewables, low carbon solutions, green technologies, etc. So it's difficult to make a hierarchy, but there's a broad patchwork of different types of actors that have different access to power resources. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no,
To
that's
me,
actually very interesting. Oh yes, no, of course, please.
For me, there's a nice, it's
segue.
I agree with Mathieu. It's not always very helpful to try and put things on a hierarchy. What is quite interesting is to work out the domino effect, that if somebody says this, then somebody else does this, and somebody else does this. And there's a really quite an interesting one that's been going on, in that we've seen some early sort of NGOs and social movements and so on getting, rightfully putting the argument for renewable energy across. One particular NGO, a group called Carbon Tracker, for me were quite interesting in that what they started saying was, if we produce all the oil and gas that we say is there, then we're going to blow the carbon budget and blow the climate. And so they started coming up with this idea of a carbon bubble or unburnable carbon. That sort of started this idea that said that, well, some of the companies in the fossil fuel industry, we're never going to produce all the stuff that they've got on their reserves, and therefore are they worth quite as much as we thought? That then sort of rippled through into people like the central banks who said, well, hang on a minute, if we suddenly devalued all these fossil fuel companies, then that would be a bit of a financial crisis, really. So they started nudging the investors, saying, look, can you actually start applying a bit more pressure on these companies to be transparent about how much reserves they've got that wouldn't be produced? And that then started influencing the companies to say, oh, perhaps we better do something different because our investors are starting to get a bit nervous. So what's really quite interesting about stakeholders is watching these sort of loops where you get influence going from one to the next to the next to the next. And there's quite a positive loop, I feel, at the moment, which involves some really quite interesting different players. Consumers as activists, it involves the NGOs putting pressure, who then sort of nudge the central banks who get worried about financial stability, who nudge the investors to get the companies to be more transparent, which nudges the companies to do different things. And then you've got the insurance industry coming in as well. So there's quite an interesting sort of, at the moment, I feel, quite positive picture where different stakeholders are interacting with each other to push us all in the right direction, hopefully.
That's actually very interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like it's a very important point, that companies, in a sense, have the backing of the investors, because of course you would have certain companies that might be, in terms of like morality or consciousness, considering that, okay, we're not necessarily working for the benefit of the planet, but their industry depends on it, and if they can't meet their stakeholders' demands and their investors' demands, it's going to be an issue for them. So knowing that there is sort of that domino effect that you're talking about that is currently seemingly taking place is it's a bit of a positive outcome, I think, of these conversations. And it kind of segues quite nicely into the next question, which is, so this is something that you both already touched upon, about whether it's more important for the private or public sector to fund sustainable energies, and what the consumer's role should be with regards to sustainable energy costs. So when I ask this, of course, I realize you already answered, in a sense, this idea that, well, it's a bit a part of everybody that has a play in making it happen. But with regards to the funding, would you say, for example, that it should be up to the consumers to front a higher cost of the energy that they have in order to help sort of propel forward sustainable energies? Or is this something that should be maybe taken on more by the government to relieve maybe some people that wouldn't necessarily be able to afford more sustainable energies, but that do want to contribute to a better solution? I might start by asking Mathieu this time.
Yeah, obviously it touches on a couple of issues that we've already discussed, but I think, I mean, if you look at it from a justice perspective, then obviously the stronger shoulders have to bear the most heavy or the heaviest burden, of course, and so it's those income groups, upper income classes that will have to carry the most financial burdens. And so I think it's necessary for these consumers, these citizens, to be willing to spend more money in the short term to be able to profit from this energy transition in the long term. And then really governments should pay attention to not rolling out measures or flat taxing so that all income groups are affected equally. And I think, for example, I mean, taxation is a very important climate policy measure as well. And so definitely progressive taxation is key here. Because if you don't do that, I mean, consumers i.e. citizens, will actually protest what policies and mitigation efforts governments are undertaking. And I think an interesting example is what happened in France at the end of 2018, 2019 with the Gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests protests there. Because obviously, if as a government you're going to impose, or you're going to levy green taxes, and you're going to levy taxes on diesel cars or on diesel, but you're going to do that, and then you're going to hurt the countryside in France. Because after decades of underinvestment, of austerity measures, there's no public transportation in the French countryside. I don't know if there are any French people here, or if you've ever been to the French countryside.
I'm actually I'm from France.
Yeah, well, then
yes,
you definitely
yes,
know, but there's
yes.
no public transportation available, or
in more
at least
rural areas.
in more
In a
rural
convenient
areas.
way, yeah.
Yeah, in a convenient way. So if you want to get from one smaller city or one small town to another using buses or trains, it's an absolute pain, especially in the French countryside.
Yeah.
So if you're going to impose taxes on those people in the countryside that are reliant on their cars, because there's no public transportation, and income levels between citizens in cities and the countryside are very differentiated as well. Higher income people live in the French cities, lower income people live in the French countryside. So if you're going to impose a tax that will hurt those lower income people with less access to public transportation, i.e. alternatives, then obviously your consumers or your citizens are going to protest. And that's what happened with these yellow vest protests, and that's what you see around the world when governments try to reform or abolish fossil fuel subsidies that at times, especially consumer subsidies, benefit lower income people. So I think it's key for governments to pay attention to these issues of progressive taxation, and having a differentiation in the cost between lower and higher income people in terms of the short term of this transition.
Yeah, that's for sure. I definitely agree with a lot of those points, especially because I think it disincentivizes people to want to work towards, not necessarily that they wouldn't be interested in supporting the cause of sustainable energies, but some people simply can't really afford to do so, and it's not necessarily per any fault of their own. So I definitely agree with that point you just made. David, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff here. I mean, this comment that Matthew's saying about you've got to be careful about applying taxes to consumers. If consumers just feel that they're having money taken from them and they don't have an affordable choice, like the situation of people in rural France, they not surprisingly get a bit annoyed. The other one is that, which is sort of touched on, which is often if you put taxes on energy costs, it unfairly penalizes people who've got lower income, because energy for transport and heating is a bigger proportion of their income than wealthier people. So that's one thing, is you've got to be careful about that you're not being unfair to people on lower incomes. The second one is people often say, well, what can I do about it? So we did some research work that said, yeah, people very keen to support sustainability, but when you say to them, well, okay, what can you do about it? They say, well, I'm not sure. Or they say, I'll turn the lights off, and it's, well, that's not actually, because we've now got much more efficient lighting, that's not necessarily the most effective thing. So there is this principle of polluter pays, which is, well, we should be taxing or pricing emissions, for where they happen, rather than sort of doing it at the consumer end and letting consumers sort of argue the answer backwards. And so I do think there's a strong argument for understanding, well, okay, let's try and make polluters pay when the pollution happens, which is typically companies, and often companies sort of fairly up the process of providing energy. And that can happen through ways like carbon pricing or carbon taxes. And so we get into that discussion of, well, okay, how can we try and influence companies early on in the process of producing energy, rather than dumping it all taxes on consumers, which are unpopular, they're not fair, and people often say, well, what can I do about it? So yeah, so I would advocate sort of considering sort of applying taxes and using carbon prices and so on early on, which typically is in the company's stage of things, rather than, there are some things which I think it's really good idea to apply taxes for consumers, but I think one needs to be careful about that. I mean, the interesting example I've got, which is just relevant at the moment, is if you go and buy a fridge or a washing machine or whatever, you'll see it's got an energy rating on it. And that was brought in because we thought it would influence consumers, that you would walk into a shop and say, oh, that one's an A rating, I'll buy an A rating, not a B rating. But what actually had happened was all the companies who make fridges, as soon as it came in, they all said, oh my God, I don't want to be seen to be producing B, C, D appliances. And so all the companies rapidly put the work in so that everything was A's. So we had to come up with A pluses and A plus pluses. And now we've got a whole new sort of thing that tries to reset A's at somewhere good. So for me, that was a really interesting example of something we thought would influence consumer behavior, but actually it very rapidly influenced company behavior in a positive way.
That's very interesting, because I didn't know that, but actually I feel like that probably had a bigger impact on being more energy efficient overall, because what you're saying, I think, is quite relevant with regards to
bigger and faster, I think was the other thing.
Yeah, it's kind of the Pareto effect. It's better to target the ones that are responsible or that have the biggest impact, rather than target the many that maybe might not have as big of an impact overall. Yeah, I think that's actually quite interesting to consider. It's not just about trying to get people to be more sustainable, but finding the place that have the biggest amount of influence.
Sorry, if I may add to that, I think, well, David and yourself, you make very good points, but there's also another possibility then, that's actually going beyond more market-based interventions, and as a government take a more interventionist approach by either, for example, focusing on industrial policies, rolling out green industrial policies as a state or as a government, but also putting a specific deadline by which the sale of internal combustion engines will be forbidden. Putting a ban on leases on public lands for fracking or for new coal mines, for example. So you have these nudging approaches, I guess, perhaps more directed at consumers, and then you have these market-based solutions such as carbon pricing, carbon taxation, cap and trade, that sort of stuff. But then there's a far more interventionist logic that is oftentimes really a bit overshadowed by the other ones, and that's this more interventionist, state-led approach of really prohibiting specific actions and specific behavior. But I understand that in specific contexts, that's not always seen as an economically efficient and effective solution.
I think it's a good solution. I think the lesson is you have to allow enough time. Or be a bit challenging about it, because I mean, in this country we've said no fossil fuel vehicles from I think it's 2025, isn't it? No new ones. But that is with an understanding that that's possible. The car companies should be able to do that, and therefore hopefully it'll work.
Yeah. And this actually reminds me, so it's not so much government policy, but this reminds me of the IMO 2020 policy with regards to maritime shipping, and the International Maritime Organization saying that they're going to have a very strict reduction in sort of sulfur emissions for ships. And actually, this is something that, well, they decided in it like a decade ago. So obviously, it was a while, but within the shipping industry, I suppose you could argue a decade isn't such a long time to make changes. But what it really did is that it forced the hand of a lot of shipping companies to really take the incentive that they otherwise wouldn't have taken, because with regards to, I guess, their own costs and their financial benefits, it didn't make sense for them to implement these changes until they were really told, well, you're going to be very heavily fined if you don't try and abide by these levels. So I think that's quite relevant. And actually, this makes me move on to my next question. So obviously, with regards to big players and looking at the areas that might have the more important influence in industries, petrochemicals, as David mentioned earlier, might be maybe one of the bigger players and the reason for the climate issue currently. And many of them are restructuring their organizations to be more involved with renewable energies, and be more of a global energy company rather than petrochemical focused company. Do you believe this to be beneficial or detrimental to energy sustainability as a whole? I might start with David this time.
Well, I'll give a short answer because I know that Mathieu does quite a lot of research in this area. I mean, for me, commercial companies only have to earn their existence by being the right people to do what we need to do, and that's why investors invest in them. And so I can understand why quite a lot of the big oil and gas companies are now talking about turning themselves into integrated energy companies. And there is some interesting differences as to, well, it's more the ones that are based in Europe, like BP and Shell and Total and so on. And we're not seeing quite so much enthusiasm from the American headquartered ones like Exxon and Chevron. And, you know, Mathieu can sort of talk through some of the reasons why. But I suppose my perspective is well, they don't deserve an existence, and they're going to have to be good at doing the other things. And so often they're saying, well, okay, we're going to move into renewables, or we're going to move into, and you say, well, there are already quite a lot of companies in renewables, and some of them are quite good. So how come are you going to be better? And they already know what they're doing, and you're saying, well, okay, we're going to have to learn. So for me, the interesting question about these companies that want to change is, well, why are they going to, you know, why do they deserve a place in the bits of the business that they're trying to move into? And there are some good reasons. So, you know, the big oil and gas companies, they say, well, we're really good at doing really big investments in new energy infrastructure and so on. And that's true. They're pretty good at deploying effective technologies, and that's true. And then the third one is they're pretty good working in partnership with lots of other companies and organizations and governments and so on, because of the nature of the work that they've done. And so I think there is an argument that says, you know, for them to move across from oil and gas into sustainable renewable solutions, they have something to offer in terms of skills that might not be there at the moment, but they're going to have to work hard to deliver it. And, you know, that's going to be interesting to watch. Mathieu, I don't know if you've got any comments.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, David. Great points. Just to start off, is it beneficial? I guess the short answer is yes, because everything that's being done is good, as long as you do something. The long answer is a bit more nuanced, if not more negative, because obviously what they're doing is not enough. I think even in the past couple of weeks, a lot of these big oil and gas companies, the likes of Shell and ExxonMobil and Chevron in the United States, or BP, have come out with strategies, and they always have these fancy investment days or investor days, and then they outline their strategies for the coming years. And then you see their graphs and their figures, and it shows where they're going to direct their capital expenditure to. And so then you basically see that even if they plan on spending billions and billions in renewables or low carbon technologies, in the case of ExxonMobil and Chevron, more in the direction of carbon capture and storage technologies. If you compare that to their overall capital expenditure, you'll see that this is actually a very, very low level. compared to their upstream investments in oil and gas and their investments in renewables and low carbon technologies. So it's like David said. I mean, there's this this tension between what they're saying they'll be doing and what they're actually doing. And if you look at it, if you look at the numbers, in order to reach the Paris Agreement objectives of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, then in this decade alone, oil production has to decline 3.5% year on year. So every year, oil production has to decline by 3.5%. But if you look at all these strategies of these companies that I just mentioned, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, or BP and Shell are a bit different, but at least Chevron and all the other big oil companies, it actually implies that, or they imply that oil production is going to increase, or at least stay flat. And so that's not nearly enough to reach these objectives of the Paris Agreement. So, and interestingly, and as David said, we've been doing a bit of research on that, and there's this division between different companies, or this categorization. You have these companies, the American ones that are facing far less external and internal shareholder pressure and external pressure from climate activists or advocates. They face far less pressure from these stakeholders, and so they're not necessarily doubling down on their oil and gas production, but they're really focusing on what can be called a business as usual scenario, as in not a lot is going to change. Oil and gas are here to stay, obviously, and in relative terms, oil and gas will lose space to renewables and low carbon solutions, but in absolute terms, oil demand and gas demand seems relatively robust for these companies. So they're basically continuing down or going down a pathway that they've been on in the past couple of years. So that's one category of companies. And then there's a second category of companies that you could call easily those companies looking to become integrated energy companies that say, well, on the one hand, we are indeed investing in renewables and low carbon solutions, but actually we also want to redirect towards, or we want to continue to uphold our investments in oil and gas because they bring in a lot of money, and we have to continue to satisfy our shareholders and our investors. And then there's this category of, and this is an interesting category, and not a lot of international oil companies have actually gone down this pathway, and that's one of radical transformation. And actually Dong Energy, which is a Danish majority state-owned company, and it was Dong was an acronym for Danish Oil and Natural Gas, and in 2009 that company renamed itself and it became Ørsted. But actually, in the past decade, it has completely transformed into one of the biggest renewable energy players in the world. And I believe they're the largest offshore energy wind producer in the world.
Yep.
And they're a middle-sized oil and gas company, or they were at the time. But it's interesting that there is indeed, or there was for these types of companies, a way forward, and there was a radical transition pathway for them. And so one last thing I would like to add to that, actually basically what you're seeing for these big oil and gas companies, BP, Shell, Total, ExxonMobil, etc., what you see today is that they're facing a couple of very important trade-offs. So first of all, they want to maintain their investments in oil and gas because they're relatively they're highly profitable. Second, they want to maintain the dividend payouts and share buybacks to continue to satisfy their investors because they need their investors' money to continue their operations and to continue their investments in their core oil and gas business. But at the same time, thirdly, they also want to transition towards renewables and low carbon solutions. So some would call this an impossible trinity or a trilemma, because you cannot do all three things at the same time as an oil and gas company. So it's interesting to see what's going on currently in the oil and gas world. And I guess to come back to what we said at the beginning, there are a lot of questions still left in terms of what's going on and what direction certain companies are taking. But the answers are very opaque still if you're not an insider in the industry.
Yeah.
I think the only comment I'd have is I think they're in more trouble because the profitability of their current oil and gas work is nothing like as good as it used to be.
Yes.
And so I think they're under more pressure to make a change faster. But let's see.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this definitely brings me back a little bit to what was mentioned of the importance of policies as well, because what you're saying is that it seems that the ones around Europe are maybe doing a transition a bit faster than the ones in the US. And well, I know that in Europe, at least, we try to have a little bit stricter energy policies and sustainability policies than maybe North America has. And it's making me wonder if that's maybe one of the reasons, one of the big factors for which there is this slight difference in between petrochemicals in Europe and petrochemicals in North America. But yes, it also brings me back to this idea of dominoes and investors. And I feel like what you said about the trilemma, it highlights that important factor that sometimes it's not just with regards to what the petrochemicals want to do, but also their stakeholders and how can they work around that. Because if they decide to make a change in their company and it's going to be detrimental to the paybacks to their stakeholders, obviously they're going to get in trouble. So it's more complicated than just saying, well, they'll make the change. But I definitely do think it's a necessary transition. And I think moving on to the last question that we have on this list, I think renewable energies is very dependent on your environment. So, for example, if you look at countries such as Denmark or some other Scandinavian countries, they have much bigger natural resources in terms of maybe wind energy or potential hydropower energy that has enabled them to make a big transition. But there is an argument that because it's very geographically dependent, it depends a lot on your local natural resources. We must rely on a global strategy rather than simply national strategies to shift to more sustainable energies. What are your thoughts about this? Do you think that that's something that is necessary, or do you think it's better to rely on individual national strategies rather than, and once again, keeping in mind that I guess coordinating energy on a global level is probably quite difficult. I might start by asking David Elmes about this.
Well, I think this is a bit of a cop-out in that you need to do things at lots of different levels, but I'd probably expand the way that you've described it. So obviously we've got the Paris Climate Change Agreement. What's quite interesting about that, and I'm sure Mathieu will have comments about this, is it's slightly a different sort of agreement than previously. So previously we would have international climate agreements where, typically a few of the developed countries would say, right, here's the rules and you've got to do this and here are your targets, and go off and meet the targets. Whereas Paris was quite different in that it was countries putting forward what they reckoned they could do, and they were all sort of pulled together, and fine, there was a bit of arm twisting and so on, but we ended up with a good agreement. And it's now got a ratchet mechanism that says, well, you come back every so often and tell us what you've done and tell us how much more you're going to do. So there is a sort of level of global agreements, and in some ways we're doing it slightly differently now, which is really interesting to see. There's also, decisions at national level. So we've got the Climate Change Act here in the UK, which sets pretty sort of clear targets for what the UK needs to do. I think for me, then you get the level down. So you start sort of saying, well, okay, you can try and solve everything at the national level. But actually, I think it's quite interesting when you start looking at things more locally. because it gets back to this idea that, well, we've always tended to solve our energy by saying, well, somebody somewhere else will supply lots of new energy, whether it's a new offshore wind farm or a new PV installation, and so on. I mean, what we're experimenting with here at the university is saying, well, okay, we should be much better at supplying, storing and using energy ourselves. I mean, we're a sort of £10 million a year energy user, and we should be doing that through looking at not just electricity but heating and then transport, because you mentioned transport earlier on, and particularly if we're going to be electrifying transport, we should be sorting all that out as a smart local energy system, rather than just using what we want and passing the problems up for somebody else to sort out. So for me, it's not just the international level, it's not just the national level, but then it's drop it down to cities, university campuses, industrial complexes and so on. And actually we need more of these smart local energy systems to sort things out, rather than just pass the problems for somebody else to deal with.
Yes, that's quite interesting. And it sort of reminds me of a discussion I had in another of the events where someone was saying, well, there's some companies that try to argue that they're lowering their emissions by planting trees elsewhere, but actually they're displacing the problem for somebody else rather than trying to fix it. Or they're contributing to reducing their emissions, but not because they're changing the way they're doing things, but because they're paying for somebody else to help.
They're passing the buck.
Yeah, in essence, yes. But yeah, no, thank you very much for those points. Actually, I think it's quite interesting and very relevant to Warwick in particular, because Warwick University is actually trying to, as you say, have a bit more of like a localized strategy for reducing emissions. So I think it's very relevant to people around campus. Matthew, would you have something that you would like to add to this?
Actually, David gave us a couple of weeks ago a really interesting presentation, and a very detailed presentation, perhaps a bit too detailed to my taste, about what's going on at the campus, actually. But it's really interesting. So if anyone has any questions about that, David is an absolute specialist on what's going on. But just to come to raise a couple of the points in terms of global climate governance, then to come back to the Paris Agreement, actually I'm not quite so convinced about the success it has generated throughout the past couple of decades, actually, because since 1990 I believe we've had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is basically the framework in which all these global negotiations that have led to the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, etc. have led. But basically, if you just use one benchmark, and that is how are CO2 emissions evolving, then it means well, nothing actually has or at least that hasn't actually been so effective. And also, if you look at it, because there's just been a new round of NDCs, nationally determined contributions, so these national climate plans that have to be submitted to the UNFCCC to see how countries are doing. And if you look at that, basically what this new round of newly submitted nationally determined contribution shows is that by 2030, or based on these NDCs, by 2030, global CO2 emissions will only be 0.5% lower than the benchmark year 2010. And in order to meet our objective of 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, global CO2 emissions have to be 45% lower by 2030 compared to 2010. So we're nowhere near the objectives that are necessary. And I guess, I mean, to a certain extent, that also refutes the argument that I made earlier, that these policies are so important, because I mean, I guess policies aren't being put in place, legislation isn't being put in place as these nationally determined contributions show. So perhaps the national level then is not the right level to look at. But perhaps an interesting idea is that of regional or interregional climate clubs. And in these climate clubs, a group of countries can basically decide to work toward a collective objective related to public good. And so, in a specific case, that can be, or the objective that they work toward can be net zero emissions. And so, the members of this regional climate club, say, for example, a group of countries that have all decided by 2050 we want to become net zero countries, like Canada, the United States, and Europe, for example, cooperating. And so they can work together based on this shared set of rules and norms. And in turn, non-members or those members of the club that are not complying to the rules and norms of their club can be, quote unquote, punished. And so, for example, this club can then start levying taxes on the import of carbon-intensive products. And then we come to this notion of carbon border levies or carbon border adjustments, it's called in European Union lingo. So there's like David said, there's different levels of governance. There's the global level, the national level, the subnational level, the local level, the university level, but there's also this level somewhere in between the local or the national and the global, for which some interesting solutions might be formulated.
I find that quite interesting that you mention having a club with countries such as the United States in particular, because so actually one of the things that when you mentioned actually some of these policies that we're trying to push, we see that they're not really having the effect necessary. One of the things that kind of came to my mind was that, well, actually, one of the biggest contributors to emissions, that is the United States, is actually one of the players who's maybe going back a little bit, or recently at least has gone back a little bit in terms of their environmental policies. And actually that probably has a much, much bigger impact than any smaller country, for example, from the European Union, like changing their policies, whereas you have lots of countries that might be trying to make a big change. If you have one of the players that have the biggest impact that has decided they don't want to contribute, then it's going to be very difficult, I suppose, to actually get to the levels we need to. And that's making me wonder, with regards to what you're saying, with this notion of having like taxation in the club, do you think it would be difficult to do something like that against the United States, who, well, currently, but I don't know how many more decades that will necessarily be the case for, but at least very much so in the present moment, they have a lot of economic power over other countries, I suppose. So do you think that would be something that would be easy to implement or feasible to implement in a way that wouldn't have negative repercussions to countries that might then get some pushback from the States in other economic areas? Sorry, I don't know how relevant that is, but
no, I think it's really interesting. So, Mathieu said, perhaps we'll end up with regional groups where, they will apply carbon border adjustments for people outside that group that haven't put as much effort into doing things. I mean, I think the risk there is you end up with a massive trade war, if you like, of environmental tariffs. I think what's quite interesting at the moment is seeing that almost like the threat of these carbon border taxes is that encouraging countries to start, doing things differently themselves. So for me, the interesting one to look at the moment is China has adopted a carbon trading scheme that covers its power sector, which is a massive amount of emissions in China. And I suppose ultimately they'll say, well, we're doing our bit in terms of taxing our electricity industry in China, so you shouldn't be applying a border tax to us. So I suppose I'm trying to be a little bit more positive saying it's not necessarily, I'm not sure that carbon adjustment taxes are the right way to go, because you end up with a great big sort of trade war of tariffs. But what they're doing, fingers crossed, is encouraging countries to address the problems in their own countries and price carbon and do the right thing in their own country, so that you wouldn't need to put these tariffs in place. And that pressure of join in or be left out Yeah, I mean, there's a lot waiting to see what's going to happen with the US and the new administration and so on. But yeah, so for me, there's an interesting tension between almost like the threat of carbon border taxes and then the responses of major countries like China to do something about it before the need for taxes arises.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I feel like that it's true that sometimes it might not even be necessary to reach the point where you have taxes. It's just incentivizing people in a way where they realize it's not going to be a long-term benefit for them to continue acting the way they are. So yes, but actually, so we've come to reach an hour. So I think we'll bring the event to a close. But I just want to say thank you very much to the both of you for taking the time today to come and do this event, especially David Elmes. I believe it's your birthday today. So thank you very much for taking the time on your birthday
Yes,
to
I'd
come.
love to have dinner with my family. So
Yes,
yes, thanks for that.
it's very much appreciated, and it was great hearing both of your opinions. Honestly, I always feel like these discussions are a great way to sort of bounce ideas off and learn new things that I didn't necessarily know before. So I hope that all the attendees also feel the same way as I do. And yes, I hope everybody had a great time today, and thank you very much for coming.